Silas May had never been the type of man who relied on others to keep his world in order. Years of working in transportation logistics for an international firm had shaped him into someone who believed in control, precision, and the necessity of drawing firm lines between what was his and what belonged to the world outside. That was why, when he bought the land at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac in a semi-rural part of Virginia, he had been willing to go further than most homeowners ever would. The road that led to his house had once been a cracked gravel lane, technically owned by the county but so neglected it was little more than 2 ruts carved into the earth. When Silas signed the purchase contract for the property, he noticed the clause that allowed him and the other 3 owners at the far end to request removal of the road from the county's maintenance roster in exchange for partial title. The other residents hesitated, but Silas saw the opportunity immediately. He negotiated with the county clerk, paid for the paperwork, and within a year he had turned the fading path into a strip of black asphalt laid with his own funds. The cost had been high, but the sense of control was worth it. He knew every inch of that pavement, knew the slight tilt near the drainage ditch, knew where the tar seam marked the boundary between his section and that of his closest neighbor, and he felt a quiet pride each time he drove home late at night. Headlights gliding over the smooth black surface that existed because of his insistence on order. For years, life in the cul-de-sac had been calm. The 3 other owners were practical people who valued the arrangement. They all signed the agreement that confirmed the road was private and not subject to county use. Deliveries came in without confusion. Garbage trucks turned only when scheduled, and visitors respected the signs posted at the entrance declaring, "Private road, residents only." Silas kept records of every resurfacing, every snowplow he hired in the winter, every repair made after storms, because he knew that ownership without proof was fragile. He never expected anyone to challenge the arrangement, and he never imagined that something as mundane as an updated county map could become a weapon against him. That sense of stability cracked the day Karen Martell moved into the house at the mouth of the cul-de-sac. She was not a woman of compromise. That much was clear within a week of her arrival. She had come from a more urban neighborhood, sold her townhouse after a divorce, and immediately began introducing herself as the new voice of reason in what she called an outdated private enclave. Silas remembered their first conversation vividly. She had approached him while he was trimming the hedges near his driveway and asked, with a falsely bright smile, why the online mapping system showed the road as public access when there were signs claiming otherwise. He explained calmly that the signs were correct, that the road was jointly owned by the 4 households at the end, and that she could review the title documents if she doubted him. Her smile faded quickly, replaced with the sharp squint of someone who did not like being corrected. Within days, she began shifting her property outward. She moved her mailbox to a point further down near the road's bend, insisting it was more convenient for the postal service. She planted decorative stakes in the grass near the entrance and positioned them as though to mark a boundary line. When Silas asked her directly what she was doing, she replied that she had spoken to someone in the county planning department who told her that in the most recent digital database the road was still tagged as municipal, not private. Silas knew the claim was nonsense. He had the official paperwork in a fireproof box in his study, but he also understood the danger of half-truths in the hands of someone persistent. A misfiled update in a government system could, under the right pressure, turn years of legal clarity into a fog of confusion. He told himself not to worry, that the law was on his side, but the unease settled into him like a cold weight. Karen was not simply a neighbor with a misunderstanding. She was a woman who believed she could bend reality if she pushed hard enough, and worse, she had the arrogance of someone who assumed institutions would follow her lead. He saw it in the way she spoke to delivery drivers as if she were the overseer of the entire street, and in the way she boasted to another neighbor that things would soon be different around here. Silas began to suspect that what she truly wanted was not clarity but control. And that meant the road he had built, the symbol of his independence, was no longer secure. The first true sign that Karen's obsession was going to turn into a battle arrived on a damp Tuesday morning when Silas went out to fetch the newspaper and found that both of the metal signs he had bolted into the ground years earlier at the entrance of the road were gone. The holes in the soil were still visible, the bolts sheared off as if someone had deliberately used tools to wrench them free, and in their place stood two flimsy stakes holding laminated paper sheets with the words, "Public access, do not obstruct," printed in large block letters. Silas felt an immediate surge of anger, but underneath it was something colder. The realization that Karen was no longer merely talking. She was acting, and she was doing it with the confidence of someone who believed she had backing from an authority beyond her own imagination. He carried the laminated sheets into his kitchen, spread them on the counter, and noticed that the bottom of each bore a printed emblem that looked official at a glance but was only a blurry reproduction of the county seal downloaded from the internet. It was amateur work, yet bold enough to create confusion for any stranger who might wander onto the property. And boldness, Silas knew, was often more dangerous than competence. That same afternoon he received a letter, not from Karen but from the county's Department of Civil Planning. It was a sterile document printed on heavy paper, informing him that the access road to his property had been temporarily designated as Reserve Thoroughfare, pending review due to its location near an undeveloped corridor slated for connection to the new state highway. Silas read the letter twice, each word cutting into him with a mix of disbelief and dread. He had worked in logistics long enough to know what Reserve Thoroughfare meant. It was bureaucratic shorthand for a road that, while not fully public, could be opened to municipal or even federal use in times of necessity. The designation was supposed to be applied only after formal hearings and unanimous consent of affected landowners. The fact that it had appeared in his mailbox without a single prior notice meant one of two things: either an astonishing administrative error or deliberate manipulation. He called the number listed on the letter, and after an hour of being passed from one extension to another, reached a young voice that identified itself as an interim records officer. When Silas asked how the change had been authorized, the young man explained in a rehearsed tone that the status adjustment had been entered into the digital map database last quarter based on available records. Silas pressed further, asking which records, who had signed them, why no physical verification had been done. The line went silent for several seconds. Then the young man admitted, almost sheepishly, that the adjustment had been a project assigned during a database modernization initiative, and that certain entries were made based on historical maps rather than current ownership documents. In other words, the entire decision rested on a mistake. Yet in bureaucratic systems, mistakes often calcified into reality once entered into the official ledger. Silas hung up with his hands trembling, not from fear but from the recognition of how easily his control could be undone. He knew Karen well enough by now to suspect her fingerprints on the matter. Perhaps she had written letters. Perhaps she had attended a town meeting where she pushed the idea that the road had been wrongfully privatized. Whatever she had done, she had exploited a gap between paperwork and reality, and that was a battlefield Silas could not ignore. The following week, matters escalated further. A flatbed truck arrived one morning carrying concrete barriers, and Silas watched from his study window as the workers, hired by Karen, began unloading them near the bend where her property met the road. When he stormed outside, demanding to know what they were doing, the foreman shrugged and pointed to a printed work order signed with Karen's name, claiming the installation was in preparation for increased public use. Silas phoned the county sheriff's office, and though an officer eventually came, the response was disheartening. The officer studied the papers, frowned, and admitted that the road's status was currently under review, which meant enforcement was unclear. The officer finally told the workers to pause, but not before Karen appeared, hands on her hips, announcing loudly that she had every right to protect community access, and that Silas should stop pretending he owned what belonged to everyone. From that moment, The fight ceased to be a quiet dispute between neighbors. Karen began circulating a petition among surrounding streets, claiming the blocked road deprived families of a vital shortcut to the nearest highway. She described Silas as a land hoarder who had tricked the county into letting him seize public infrastructure. Though many neighbors rolled their eyes at her dramatics, enough signed her petition to give it weight when she brought it to the Planning Commission. Silas heard about it only when an envelope arrived from the commission inviting him to a hearing where the matter of the road's classification would be reviewed with community input. What unsettled Silas most was not Karen's noise, but the silence of some of his fellow owners. He approached Jeremy, one of the longtime residents at the cul-de-sac's far end, expecting solidarity. But Jeremy only muttered that perhaps the road being public wouldn't be so bad, that at least then the county would handle maintenance. Silas tried to remind him of the costs already paid, the years of autonomy, the signed deeds, but Jeremy seemed weary, almost seduced by the idea of letting responsibility slip away. It was then Silas understood that Karen's fight was not simply external pressure, it was erosion from within, and that made it far harder to resist. Each night he found himself walking the length of the asphalt he had once laid with pride, staring at the faint line where the tar seam caught the moonlight, and imagining what it would feel like to see military convoys, delivery vans, or even casual drivers tearing over it as if it were nothing more than another stretch of public tarmac. The thought made his stomach tighten. This was no longer about convenience or neighborly quarrels. It was about ownership, identity, and the creeping realization that once the state stamped its approval on a mistake, the truth of private property could dissolve like mist in the morning. The hearing at the county commission was supposed to be routine, a procedural formality in which Silas could present his deeds, maps, and contracts, prove that the road had been lawfully privatized, and leave with his rights reaffirmed. Instead, it became the stage for the first real escalation of the conflict. From the moment Silas entered the hall, he could sense the atmosphere had already been poisoned. Karen was seated in the front row with a binder stacked full of papers, some official, most obviously printed from websites and blogs, but she held them with the authority of someone presenting an airtight case. Around her were a handful of residents from adjacent streets, people who had little stake in the matter but who had been lured by her promises that a public road would bring easier access, better delivery routes, and even raise property values. When Silas took his seat, he could hear them whispering words like selfish and blocking progress. When his turn came to speak, he carefully laid out the history. The county's withdrawal from maintenance 15 years earlier, the contract signed. By all then owners, the funds paid by him personally to pave and repair the road, the tax records showing its exclusion from public inventory. He produced certified maps with the county seal, notarized affidavits from 2 previous residents, and copies of the maintenance receipts he had filed year after year. The commissioners listened politely, but their expressions were unreadable. When Karen rose to speak, the room shifted. She spoke not of documents but of emotion, describing how the road had been stolen from the people, how mothers with children had to drive miles out of their way, how elitist homeowners like Silas were barricading themselves behind signs while the rest of the community suffered. She brandished a large printout of the county's digital map, which still showed the road in faint gray lines connecting to the broader grid, and argued that this was proof the road had never been properly removed. When one commissioner asked where she had obtained her information, she replied triumphantly, "From your own database." The discussion dragged on for hours, and though no ruling was issued, the commission decided to table the matter for further review. That phrase, Silas knew, was bureaucratic poison. It meant uncertainty, delay, and opportunity for Karen to continue stirring the waters. Worse, the commission directed him not to alter or obstruct the road in any way until the review was complete. For the first time in years, Silas felt his grip loosen. He returned home to find Karen already celebrating in her driveway with two neighbors, sipping wine and laughing loudly, as though the matter were already settled in her favor. What followed in the days after was a campaign of slow strangulation. One morning, Silas awoke to find a delivery truck idling halfway down the cul-de-sac, the driver explaining that someone had told him the road was now open for public access and he could use it as a shortcut. Another afternoon, he returned from errands to find a landscaping crew unloading equipment, claiming they had been hired by the Community Association to prepare the roadside for widening. Silas knew there was no such association, only Karen, but the crew waved a signed order with her name on it. Though he forced them to leave, the damage was done. Tire ruts dug into the edges of the asphalt, the once pristine surface scarred. He called the sheriff again, but the deputy who arrived simply shook his head. With the commission review pending, enforcement was complicated. The deputy even suggested that perhaps Silas should work something out with his neighbor, rather than fight City Hall. The words stung, not because they were hostile, but because they revealed the reality. Authorities preferred convenience over truth, and Karen had created the image of a dispute too messy to resolve quickly. At night, Silas began to notice cars he didn't recognize idling near the entrance of the road. Some turned back, others drove slowly down the cul-de-sac before realizing it was not a throughway. He suspected Karen had deliberately posted misleading directions online, perhaps even updated GPS platforms with false entries. The quiet privacy he had fought to secure was unraveling. His dogs barked more often, disturbed by the unusual traffic, and he found himself sitting awake in his study with the documents spread across his desk, trying to reassure himself that the law was still on his side. The breaking point came on a Friday evening when Karen arrived at his door with a uniformed officer at her side. She had filed a complaint claiming that Silas had placed unauthorized barriers on a public road because earlier that day he had set out orange safety cones near a section of pavement that had begun to crack. The officer was polite but firm, warning Silas that interfering with a road under review could be considered obstruction. Karen stood slightly behind, her face composed into a mask of false innocence, but her eyes glimmered with triumph. Silas tried to argue, pointing to his deeds, but the officer simply said, "Take it up with the commission. Until then, keep it clear." As she walked away, Karen whispered just loudly enough for him to hear, "You can't hide behind your paperwork forever." Those words lingered like a toxin. Silas realized this was no longer about misunderstanding or even greed. It was a deliberate campaign to strip him of ownership by weaponizing bureaucracy. He had spent his life mastering logistics, predicting the movement of freight and vehicles across continents, but he had not foreseen how vulnerable his own narrow strip of asphalt could be to one determined neighbor who understood the power of persistence and perception. For the first time since the conflict began, he felt a flicker of genuine fear, not for his safety but for the possibility that he might lose the road entirely. Silas had always believed that persistence and evidence could overcome noise, but the weeks following the commission's hearing revealed how fragile that belief was. The road that had once been a symbol of his independence was no longer silent. It was a contested line, and every day seemed to bring a new incursion that reminded him how quickly order could decay. Delivery vans now attempted to cut through with increasing frequency. Drivers citing GPS instructions that mysteriously directed them into the cul-de-sac and out toward the fields beyond, as if the road were already marked as a connector to the unfinished highway. Each time Silas tried to correct the drivers, he heard the same explanation. The system had updated, and the maps they followed now showed his asphalt strip as accessible. He began to suspect Karen had filed requests with mapping companies to adjust their data, exploiting the very digital shortcuts that modern infrastructure depended upon. One evening, exhausted by the constant intrusions, Silas sat down with the fireproof box that contained every document he had ever collected on the road. He laid them across his dining table like a cartographer charting the course of a forgotten land. surveys with signatures, deeds stamped with the county seal, contracts showing the county's official withdrawal from maintenance, tax statements proving that since the transfer of ownership, he and the other residents had borne full responsibility for repairs. As he studied the papers, he found a discrepancy that gnawed at him. The most recent deed included a clause that was not present in the original agreement, a line noting that the road's exclusion from the county inventory was subject to periodic administrative review. It was vague, a phrase that looked like the kind of bureaucratic boilerplate no one ever questioned. But to Silas it was evidence that his ownership was not as absolute as he had always assumed. The following morning he visited the county recorder's office, determined to untangle the origins of that clause. The clerk, an older woman with a tired patience, pulled the files and confirmed that the line had been inserted during a digital modernization project 5 years earlier. She admitted that no new signatures had been collected, that the phrase had simply been copied into all relevant deeds when the paper archives were scanned into the electronic system. "It doesn't mean much," she said with a shrug, but Silas felt the floor tilt beneath him. In bureaucratic terms, "doesn't mean much" often meant "will become decisive the moment someone challenges it." As he left the building, he received a call from a woman introducing herself as Tara Whitfield, a junior attorney who handled procedural disputes for the county. She explained she had reviewed his inquiry and suggested a meeting. They met later that afternoon at a cafe near the courthouse, where Tara spoke candidly in a low voice, glancing over her shoulder as though wary of being overheard. She admitted the designation of his road as Reserve Thoroughfare had been a mistake triggered by an overzealous intern during the modernization project. The intern had cross-referenced old maps that still showed the cul-de-sac as a potential connector to the future highway, and instead of flagging it for review, he had entered it into the database as if it were active. That entry then propagated through every linked system, from county planning to state transportation to commercial mapping platforms. By the time anyone noticed, the error had become official. Silas asked why it could not simply be corrected, but Tara explained that the situation had become politically entangled. The highway expansion was a sensitive project, mired in budget overruns and delays, and admitting to a clerical mistake now would risk lawsuits and public outrage. The easiest path, from the county's perspective, was to let the review process play out, even if it took months, because then the decision could be framed as due diligence, rather than correction of incompetence. She looked at him with something between sympathy and resignation and said, "I know it isn't fair, but in these systems, perception is often stronger than property law." That evening, Silas sat in his study staring at the black window that reflected his own weary face. He realized Karen had either stumbled into or deliberately exploited a vulnerability he could never have predicted. She had not forged deeds or bribed officials. She had merely pulled on the loose thread of bureaucratic error, and the entire fabric of his ownership was now at risk of unraveling. For the first time, he considered that his battle might not be winnable through documentation alone. The true midpoint came days later when an envelope arrived from the Department of Defense Logistics Office. It informed him that, due to the road's temporary designation as reserve access, a convoy of National Guard vehicles would be scheduled to use it during upcoming training maneuvers. Silas read the letter 3 times, each word sinking into him with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The very thing he had feared, the transformation of his private road into a thoroughfare for heavy vehicles, was now reality. The convoy would not arrive tomorrow, nor even the following week, but the letter made clear that advance preparations were to be expected, and any obstruction would be considered interference with the federal operations. When he confronted Karen about it, she did not deny her involvement. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, and said with a smirk, "It seems the government agrees with me. Roads are for the people, not for one man's ego." Silas felt the urge to shout, but instead he turned and walked back to his house, every step echoing with the knowledge that his struggle had shifted into a different dimension. This was no longer about neighborhood squabbles or petitions. It was about the weight of state power bearing down on him, legitimizing her narrative. Late that night, he returned to his dining table, spreading out the papers once again. But this time he did not look for reassurance. He looked for leverage. If the county and the military were both bound by an error, then the only way forward was to expose that error in a way that could not be ignored, even if it meant pulling others into the fight. He began making notes, drafting letters, considering not only legal appeals but also the possibility of drawing attention to the contradiction between the deeds and the database. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to manage logistics for others, to bring order to chaos, and now he would have to apply those skills to his own survival. The midpoint was not the arrival of the convoy itself, but the recognition that it was coming, inexorable, like a line of heavy engines already rumbling in the distance. Silas understood that everything he valued, his independence, his home, his carefully maintained strip of asphalt, was now balanced on the edge of a bureaucratic error that had taken on the force of law. For the first time in his life, he realized that winning would require more than patience and paperwork. It would demand strategy, risk, and the willingness to confront not just a neighbor, but the machinery of the state itself. The weeks leading up to the convoy's arrival were marked by a steady deterioration of order, as if the neighborhood itself had become a contested borderland where no one knew whose rules applied. Silas tried to live as he had before, working from home, maintaining his property, and keeping his files organized in preparation for the commission's next review, but every day brought new evidence that the balance had shifted. Delivery trucks began parking along the entrance to the road, idling with the assumption that the strip was now theirs to use. Maintenance crews, some hired by the county, others contracted by Karen without approval, appeared at odd hours to measure distances and mark the pavement with orange paint as though preparing for widening. Even the trash collection company, which for years had respected the residents' private contract, suddenly switched routes, sending larger municipal trucks that left grooves in the asphalt. Each incident alone might have been tolerable, but together they formed a pattern. His control was gone, and his road was being consumed by an administrative machine that no longer recognized his ownership. Karen, meanwhile, had grown more audacious. She erected a row of ornamental planters along the curve where her property touched the asphalt, narrowing the passage so that only one vehicle could pass at a time. When Silas confronted her, she smiled sweetly and explained that since the road was now public, she was simply beautifying the neighborhood. She even organized a small gathering, inviting neighbors from other streets to walk and picnic near the bend, laying out folding chairs as though it were a park. Silas photographed everything, documenting the intrusion. But when he presented the images to the sheriff's office, the deputy who received him only shook his head and said that without a clear ruling from the commission, enforcement remained uncertain. The phrase had become a refrain that mocked him. Uncertain, pending, under review. One evening, as the sun dropped low and shadows stretched across the asphalt, Silas returned from a meeting with Tara, the county attorney who had quietly admitted the original error, to find a yellow notice taped to his gate. It was an official order, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense, instructing him not to obstruct or alter the road in any way before the scheduled training maneuvers. The language was clinical, but the implication was crushing. Any attempt to reclaim his property could now be construed not merely as a civil dispute, but as interference with federal operations. He stood there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, realizing that what had once been his sanctuary was now, at least temporarily, under the shadow of military authority. The escalation reached its peak when Karen, emboldened by the letter she must have anticipated, parked her SUV directly across the road one Saturday morning, declaring to a small crowd of neighbors that she was exercising her right to protest. She placed trash bins, plastic barriers, and even a garden bench in a line, blocking passage completely. Silas confronted her with fury, demanding she remove the obstacles, but she only crossed her arms and said, "If this is a public road, then I can use it as I see fit. And if the military wants to drive through, they'll have to go around my property." It was a reckless gesture, and Silas warned her she was inviting disaster, but she only laughed, convinced that her defiance would force the county to finally side with her. When the convoy arrived 2 days later for a test run, the disaster unfolded exactly as Silas had feared. The first vehicles slowed as they encountered the blockade, soldiers stepping out to assess the obstruction, but orders were orders, and the column behind pressed forward. The lead truck attempted to maneuver around the barricade, its tires grinding into Karen's manicured lawn. A second vehicle followed, tearing deeper across the grass, crushing a decorative stone wall she had built along the edge. The sound of splintering wood and breaking stone echoed across the cul-de-sac, and Karen screamed from her porch, waving her arms and shouting that her property was being destroyed. Silas watched from his own driveway, powerless, his heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and dread. He had warned her, but seeing the machines roll over her lawn was less victory than confirmation that the road, and everything tied to it, was no longer his to command. In the aftermath, Karen called the sheriff, the county, even the Department of Defense, demanding compensation for the damage. She accused Silas of conspiring with the military to target her, spinning a narrative in which she was the victim of harassment. Yet the photographs taken by the convoy officers told a different story. Her vehicle and barriers were clearly blocking the designated route, her lawn sacrificed not to malice but to the momentum of bureaucracy. For a moment, Silas thought this would end the dispute, that her recklessness would discredit her completely, but instead the incident fueled her resolve. She filed a new petition, this time not only demanding recognition of the road as public, but also compensation for what she called military trespass. Silas felt the walls close in. He had spent years mastering systems of order, believing that proof and patience were enough to prevail. But now he saw how easily a determined neighbor, armed with half-truths and bureaucratic inertia, could unravel everything he had built. The escalation was no longer about signs or petitions. It was about survival, about whether his private world could withstand the grinding machinery of state power and the relentless will of one woman who refused to accept boundaries. The courtroom was filled with the heavy air of anticipation that only arises when private disputes collide with the machinery of government. And as Silas sat at the defendant's table beside his attorney, he felt the culmination of months of tension, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. Karen was opposite him, her expression carefully sculpted into the mask of a wronged citizen. Her lawyer stacking papers in neat piles as though quantity alone could substitute for substance. She had filed her lawsuit in broad strokes, accusing Silas of orchestrating the destruction of her property by conspiring with the military, claiming emotional distress, property damage, and violation of her rights as a resident on what she insisted was a public road. It was a bold claim, built less on fact than on the chaos of the convoy incident. But boldness had carried her this far, and Silas knew that the line between truth and narrative was thinner in court than most believed. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, and the proceedings began with Karen's attorney presenting her case. He spoke of community access, of outdated deeds, of the county's own digital maps that still showed the road as part of the grid. He described Karen as a woman defending her community against an overbearing neighbor who clung to a private fiefdom. At one point, he projected photographs of her lawn, scarred by the tracks of military vehicles, and the sight of crushed hedges and shattered stone walls drew sympathetic murmurs from the small audience seated behind her. Silas kept his face still, but inside he felt the cold sweep of frustration. Images could wound more deeply than facts, and Karen understood the power of spectacle. Then came his turn. His attorney rose with calm precision, spreading out certified deeds, notarized contracts, and tax records that trace the road's private status back more than a decade. She explained the clerical error that had reintroduced the road into the county database, quoting directly from Tara Whitfield, the junior attorney who had admitted to the mistake. Tara herself was called as a witness, and though her voice trembled, she testified clearly that the road's designation as reserve thoroughfare had been entered without legal authority and was a product of bureaucratic oversight. The defense then presented the military's own report from the convoy, which included photographs showing Karen's vehicle and barricades deliberately blocking the route, confirming that the damage to her lawn was the consequence of her own obstruction. Rather than any coordinated plan, the judge studied each exhibit with a grave expression, occasionally adjusting his glasses, and Silas watched closely for the subtle shifts that might reveal which way the decision would fall. The tension reached its peak when Karen herself took the stand. She spoke passionately, painting herself as the victim of intimidation, insisting that Silas had manipulated documents and hidden information from the community. But under cross-examination, her certainty faltered. When asked to produce any original deed that proved the road remained public, she could only point to the county's online map, and when confronted with the official records showing otherwise, she grew defensive, insisting the digital system was more modern and therefore more reliable. The turning point came when the defense produced the laminated public access sign she had posted weeks earlier, their blurry county seal exposed as nothing more than a copied image. The courtroom murmured as the judge examined the sheets, his frown deepening. Karen's lawyer tried to argue they were symbolic, but the damage was done. Her credibility cracked in full view of the court. At last, the judge leaned forward, his voice steady as he delivered the ruling. He acknowledged the confusion created by the county's error, but affirmed unequivocally that the road was private property jointly owned by the residents of the cul-de-sac, with deeds that carried full legal authority. He dismissed Karen's claims for compensation, stating that the damage to her lawn was the result of her own unauthorized blockade of a designated training route. Furthermore, he ordered her to pay Silas's legal fees and warned her that continued interference with the road would subject her to civil penalties. The words fell like a hammer, and though Silas kept his composure, inside he felt the surge of release that comes only when a relentless weight is finally lifted. Karen's face was a study in disbelief, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting as though searching for an escape. She rose abruptly, whispering furiously to her lawyer, but the decision was final, and the courtroom was already emptying. Silas gathered his papers with steady hands, resisting the urge to look back at her, for victory was not triumph but exhaustion, and he wanted only to step outside into the cool air, free of the stifling walls that had contained months of his life. Yet, even as he walked from the courthouse, he knew the scars remained. His road had been defended, his ownership upheld, but the image of military vehicles tearing across a neighbor's lawn, the petitions, the hearings, the sleepless nights, all of it had carved into him the knowledge that property, no matter how carefully documented, was never as secure as he had once believed. When the dust of the courtroom battle finally settled and the legal ruling stood firm without appeal, Silas returned to his home with a strange mixture of relief and fatigue that felt almost heavier than the conflict itself, because victory did not erase the months of attrition that had worn him down but only marked the end of the struggle. The road lay quiet once more, its black surface unscarred by the intrusions of delivery trucks or military convoys, and the fresh signs he ordered, engraved in steel and anchored with concrete, declared its private status with an authority that no blurred seal could challenge. Neighbors who had once wavered between his side and Karen's now approached him with careful words, some apologizing for their hesitation, others thanking him for protecting the integrity of the cul-de-sac. And, though Silas accepted their gestures, he no longer looked at them with the same easy trust, for he had seen how quickly convenience could outweigh principle when people were forced to choose. Karen herself withdrew from public view after the ruling, her lawn repaired but stripped of its former pride, her laughter no longer heard on warm evenings, and within 2 months a real estate sign appeared on her property, its bright letters, promising a new beginning to strangers who did not know the weight of the conflict that had played out on this narrow stretch of asphalt. Silas did not celebrate her departure, nor did he relish his vindication, because he had come to understand that property was less about ownership and more about vigilance, and that no deed or contract could defend itself without the resolve of the one who held it. On the evening the new signs were installed, he walked the length of the road slowly, the twilight painting the sky in shades of copper, and he felt the quiet pride of a man who had faced not only a neighbor's hostility, but also the indifference of a system that could so easily have erased his rights. He thought of how fragile security truly was, how a single clerical error and a determined adversary had nearly stripped him of the thing he valued most, and he realized that what he had defended was not simply a road, but the principle that boundaries mattered, that promises written and signed had to be honored even when inconvenient. As he reached the end of the asphalt and turned back toward the glow of his house, he let out a long breath, knowing that the battle was over, but also knowing that he would never again see his road as a simple strip of pavement. It had become the measure of his endurance, the proof of his unwillingness to surrender what was rightfully his, and in that quiet recognition lay a victory more enduring than any judgment stamped by the court.